This is the last essay for this Philosophy 110 course. This essay is called A Different Voice by Carol Gilligan, a Harvard psychologist. This essay will be covered on your final exam, but it's not covered on any other test. You will have one question about it on the final. Now, what do I want to say about Carol Gilligan? Well, Carol Gilligan is going to argue that philosophical theories of ethics and psychological theories of moral development have been biased, often unconsciously biased, in favor of men who, as a group, she maintains, think differently about a number of values from the way in which women typically think, though there'll be lots of exceptions among individuals. Here's what the book says. The editors say, Carol Gilligan is criticizing a form of golden rule ethics in her essay. Lawrence Kohlberg, an influential developmental psychologist, developed an argument in moral psychology to show that the ethics of the golden rule, the ability to apply universal principles fairly, is the highest stage of moral development. That is psychological maturity. On Kohlberg's scale of moral development, ethical egoism and obedience to authority are the least developed levels of moral development. Utilitarianism is higher, but not as advanced as golden rule morality. Gilligan challenges Kohlberg's theory because it embodies a gender-biased approach to the moral life, since males take abstract principles and rules more seriously than females who take care, personal feelings, and concrete details more seriously. This, quote, different voice, end quote, needs to supplement the appeal to rules and principles to round out the moral life, according to Gilligan. Okay? So Gilligan is saying that the moral life requires a delicate and complex balancing of complementary but competing considerations. Now that's very abstract. Okay, well, let's make it more concrete. So men, for example, again, there will be lots of exceptions, but men as a group, according to Gilligan and some other researchers, tend to value abstract rules and principles more than women, so including the golden rule, let's say. And so men are going to emphasize, let's say, the abstract principles of justice. Women are going to emphasize more mercy. Men are going to emphasize the individual freedom and personal autonomy. Women are going to emphasize our relationships and the extent to which we are interdependent, that is to say, dependent on one another. Okay, men are going to emphasize individual rights. Women are going to emphasize our interconnectedness and our being responsible for others, including perhaps even strangers who are less fortunate than we are. Okay, so you're going to have a kind of a balancing that needs to be done between the masculine and feminine point of view. We need both, according to Gilligan. We certainly need justice, but we also need it to be tempered by mercy. We need to emphasize the importance of individuals, but understand the extent to which individuals get meaning from their relationships with others. We need to emphasize individual rights, but understand the extent to which we're all in this together and we're interconnected, and we have to help those who are less fortunate. Okay, so the fact of the matter is, Gilligan is saying that moral life is complex, and yet because men very often tend to look at the world differently from women, and they have reflected their perspective in psychological theories of moral development and philosophical theories of ethics, because most of these things were created by men rather than women, and that's why she said, well, now it's time to listen to a different voice. Okay, so here's what let me quote from her, and some of it is very abstract. She writes, very bright person, very well educated person. At the same time, she writes like a social scientist. It's not the same kind of style you would get from a person who's a literary person like C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is very lucid, very clear, very learned, but very clear. But anyway, let's look at, here's what she has to say. Kohlberg's work delineates in its purest form a rational morality of justice and rights. While the power of this ethic lies in the respect accorded to the individual, its limitation lies in its failure to see a world of relationship, compassion, and care. Focusing on the individual as primary in his construction of the moral domain, Kohlberg derives the connections between people first from the constraint of authority and subsequently through deals of even exchange, stereotypic norms of relationship, societal systems of roles and rules, fair and equal contracts, and finally rational agreement. The aim of the moral development is to free individuals from societal constraint, to make them independent of civil society by protecting their rights and limiting their duties to the granting of reciprocal respect. And then she says later, whereas justice emphasizes the autonomy of the person, care underlies the primacy of relationship. Thus, justice gives rise to an ethic of rights, and care engenders an ethic of responsibility. Okay, and then there's some other things that she has to say that are worth quoting. She says, if the concept of morality contains a fundamental tension between the ethics of justice and of care, then the delineation of moral development requires a more complex rendering of social experience. And then she says, the development of the idea of justice as traced to the work of Piaget and Kohlberg depends on the experience of equality and autonomy that generates and is in turn sustained by the logic of fairness and rights. In the life cycle, adolescence brings issues of equality to the fore, and the development of formal thought at that time can extend the understanding of fairness from a logic of rules to a principal conception of rights, which then provides a justification for freedom, individual respect, and separation from others. Thus, we would expect, as Kohlberg found, that the logic of justice flourishes during adolescence, especially in times of social change, when the sense of possibility expands. The flourishing of justice would be fostered by the development of analytic modes of thought and by the experience of equal participation in democratic social institutions. Okay, so part of what she's saying is that although men and women tend to think differently about a number of values, as we've discussed earlier, that when it comes in adolescence, between childhood and adulthood, that there's not such a distinct difference between the sexes. In other words, adolescent males and females tend to emphasize freedom, personal autonomy, privacy, independence. Anyway, but she says as people develop into adults, there's more of a gap between the way in which most men think about a number of these values and the way in which most women think, though there are going to be lots of individual exceptions. And then she says later, the age-old dialogue between justice and love, okay, there's you got the masculine and feminine, reason and compassion, fairness and forgiveness, reflects not just two opposing or complementary conceptions of the moral domain, but the fundamental tension in human psychology between the experience of separation and the experience of connection. As the experience of attachment and separation run through the cycle of human life, they give rise to the paradoxical truths that describe our social experience, that we know ourselves as individual and separate only insofar as we live in connection with others, and that we experience relationship only insofar as we differentiate other from self. Despite their underlying interconnection, however, the experiences of self and relationship are discrete. That's discrete. In other words, distinct and separate. And these discrete experiences in turn give rise to two different moral languages. The language of rights that justifies separation and thus fosters and protects autonomy, and the language of responsibility that sustains relationships and informs the activity of care. Okay? So what she's saying is that the moral life is complex. It involves, to some degree, seeing people as separate and as individual and talking about their individual rights, but it also involves connection and attachment to others. And the masculine side, she says, in general, emphasizes separation, distinctness of individuals, personal freedom, personal autonomy. And she says the feminine side is more related to our interconnectedness, our relationships, our responsibility for others. And so she says we need both. We need justice and we need mercy. We need to respect individual rights, but understand the extent to which we are responsible for others, and our lives gain significance from our relationships with others. Okay, we need to esteem reason, but we also need to esteem care and compassion. So in any event, I want you to understand that Gilligan is saying that as groups, men and women tend to think differently about a number of values, yet the values that men tend to esteem more highly than women tend to esteem have been uncritically accepted in many ethical theories, philosophical ethical theories, and then psychological theories of moral development. Now, why is that? That's because those things have disproportionately been created by men who have often had unconscious bias, thinking they've tried to generalize from their perspectives, and without giving due consideration to a feminine point of view. Okay, basically that's what you need to understand. You need to understand that according to Gilligan, men and women tend to think differently about a whole range of values, but that historically the feminine voice has not been adequately attended to and adequately esteemed. And that's because men have this bias, often unconscious, in favor of their point of view, and so women, their voices have not been sufficiently heard. Basically, that's what you need to know about Gilligan. You're going to be getting one question on Gilligan on the final exam. Okay? And anyway, that is pretty much what I wanted to cover for the Gilligan essay, A Different Voice.